The village had been burning for 3 hours before anyone noticed the man standing at the edge of the tree line. Not because he was hard to see, he wasn't. He stood in plain sight, hands in his pockets, watching the flames with the kind of expression most people reserve for a slightly disappointing dinner. The demon responsible for the fire was enormous, easily 3 stories tall, its body a grotesque fusion of muscle and bone that had taken it the better part of a decade to grow into. It had killed 11 demon slayers in the past 2 months alone, and the Demon Slayer Corps had classified it as an imminent threat, requiring a Hashira response. Somewhere behind the burning houses, 2 young slayers were bleeding out in the dirt, their breathing techniques exhausted, their bodies already past the point of fighting back. The demon turned its 6 eyes toward the small, bald man at the edge of the trees, fully expecting to feel the satisfying tremor of fear that every human eventually produced. Instead, the man yawned, rolled his shoulders once, and started walking forward like he was crossing a parking lot to reach a convenience store. What happened next lasted less than 2 seconds, and by the time the dust settled, the demon that had terrorized 3 provinces was simply gone, not defeated, not wounded, just gone, and the man was already looking around for somewhere to sit down. Nobody in the Demon Slayer Corps knew his name yet. By the time they did, nothing in their world would ever be the same. If you think you already know how this ends, you don't. Subscribe once and stay with the story, because once Saitama finishes with this world, the Demon Slayer Corps will never be the same again. The first thing Tanjiro Kamado noticed about the stranger was that he had no scent of a demon slayer. That sounds like a small thing, but to someone with a nose as refined as Tanjiro's, it was profoundly disorienting. Every demon slayer carried a particular combination of smells, the faint chemical trace of wisteria, the sharp iron edge of a well-maintained blade, the particular kind of exhaustion that came from training the body past its natural limits for years at a time. This man had none of that. He smelled like someone who had walked a very long distance, was mildly hungry, and had absolutely nothing on his mind. He was standing in the middle of what used to be the village of Kainmari, which 3 hours ago had been a functioning settlement of roughly 200 people, and which now looked like something had punched a hole through the center of it. Not burned it, not torn it apart in the chaotic way demons usually destroyed things. Just punched a hole through it, clean and sudden, like the village had argued with geometry and lost. Tanjiro had arrived expecting to find survivors and a demon. He found survivors and this man instead, and the demon was nowhere, not hiding, not fled, just absent in the way that things become absent when they are no longer structurally capable of existing. He approached carefully, one hand on the hilt of his sword, his total concentration breathing already half engaged out of pure instinct. The man was sitting on a chunk of broken wall, eating something from a small cloth he had apparently been carrying in his pocket, and he looked up when Tanjiro got close with an expression of mild acknowledgement, the kind you give someone who sits down next to you on a public bench. He was completely bald, wearing what appeared to be a plain yellow suit that had seen better days, and his eyes held the particular quality of someone who had long ago made peace with being permanently underwhelmed by the world around them. "Excuse me," Tanjiro said, because he had been raised with manners and that instinct did not switch off even in the ruins of a demon attack. "Did you see what happened here?" The man looked around at the destruction with a slow, considered gaze, as if taking a genuine inventory of the situation, and then looked back at Tanjiro. "There was a demon," he said, "pretty big one. I took care of it." He said this with the same energy someone uses to mention they took out the garbage. Tanjiro's hand tightened slightly on his sword hilt, not from aggression but from sheer cognitive difficulty, because the sentence he had just heard did not map correctly onto anything in his understanding of how demon extermination worked. Taking care of a demon of that classification, and from the residual scent alone, Tanjiro could tell this had been something genuinely dangerous, required a trained slayer with a Nichiren blade, specific breathing forms, and usually backup. This man had none of those things visible on his person. "You took care of it," Tanjiro repeated slowly. By yourself. The man nodded once, finished whatever he was eating, folded the cloth back up and tucked it into his pocket. Yeah, it wasn't much. Tanjiro opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again. His nose was telling him something his brain kept refusing to fully process, which was that this man was not lying. There was no deceptive scent, no nervous chemical signal, no trace of adrenaline that would indicate someone exaggerating a close call. The man was simply telling the truth the way you tell the truth about something that happened while you were walking to the store. He had seen a demon. He had dealt with it. He had found a place to sit. That was the complete sequence of events as far as he was concerned. What Tanjiro didn't know yet, and what would take him considerably longer to begin understanding, was the nature of what he was standing in front of. The man's name was Saitama, and he had come from a world so different from this one that the gap between them was not measurable in any practical sense. He had trained himself, through a regiment so absurdly simple that martial artists would laugh at it, into a state of physical existence that had moved permanently past the category of human. He had broken his own limiter, the biological ceiling that every living thing carries, and come out the other side into a place where strength simply had no upper bound anymore. He had defeated gods, monsters, creatures that rewrote reality around themselves, beings that consumed planets for sport, and every single one of those fights had ended the same way, with one punch and a vague feeling of disappointment. He did not know how he had arrived in this world. He had been walking home from the grocery store. There had been a strange light, and then he was standing in a forest that smelled wrong, in a time period that appeared to predate indoor plumbing, wearing the same suit he always wore. He was not frightened by this. He was mildly inconvenienced by it, the way you are mildly inconvenienced when a train is delayed. He had decided to walk around until something made sense, and along the way he had encountered a very large creature that was destroying a village and eating people, and he had punched it, and now there was no more creature. This was all straightforward to him. The young man with the checkered hayari and the extraordinary nose was the first person to approach him since he arrived, and Saitama was genuinely willing to have a conversation if it led to useful information, like where the nearest town with a grocery store was. Tanjiro took a slow breath, processed what his nose was telling him one more time just to be certain, and made a decision. "I'm Tanjiro Kamado," he said. "I'm a demon slayer. The organization I work for, the Demon Slayer Corps, they're going to want to know about this, about you." Saitama considered this for a moment. "Is there food involved?" Tanjiro blinked. Yes, I think meals are provided at the headquarters." Saitama stood up, brushed some dust off his suit with two flat palms, and looked at Tanjiro with the closest thing to enthusiasm he had shown since arriving in this world. "Okay," he said. "Lead the way." Somewhere in the darkness beyond the ruined village, two surviving slayers who had witnessed everything from behind a collapsed building were staring at each other with expressions that had moved well past shock into a kind of blank, rebooting silence. One of them would file a report in the morning. That report would reach the Hashira within 3 days. And when it did, the careful, ancient machinery of the Demon Slayer Corps would begin turning in a direction it had never turned before, toward a question none of its members had ever needed to ask. What do you do with a human being who doesn't need any of the things that make a demon slayer? The report that arrived at Demon Slayer Corps headquarters was written by a 19-year-old slayer named Koichi, who had survived the Kane Mori incident by hiding behind a collapsed grain storage building and watching everything through a gap in the broken wood. Koichi was not a dramatic person by nature. His field reports were known among the administrative staff for being almost aggressively factual, the kind of writing that stripped every event down to observable data and refused to editorialize. His supervisors appreciated this quality, which is why the report that landed on Kaguya Yubayashiki's desk that morning was so deeply alarming, not because of what it described, but because of how Koichi had chosen to describe it. Halfway through the account, the clinical language simply stopped, and in its place was a single sentence written in slightly uneven handwriting, as though the author's hand had not been entirely steady. I do not have the correct words for what I saw, so I am going to write exactly what happened and ask that someone else find the words. What followed was a precise, sequential account of a bald man in a yellow suit walking toward a Class A demon with his hands in his pockets, and ending the encounter in less time than it takes to exhale. Kaguya read the report twice, which was unusual for him, and then sat quietly for a long moment in the way he did when processing something that required genuine recalibration. He was a man who had spent his entire life inside the architecture of a war he had inherited, a war with known rules and known enemies and a known shape. Demons had hierarchies. Demon slayers had breathing techniques. The relationship between those two facts was the entire foundation of everything the Corps had ever built. A human being who killed demons without breathing techniques was not just an anomaly. It was a structural impossibility, the kind of thing that, if true, required you to go back to the very beginning of your understanding and ask which parts of it had been wrong all along. He called for his most trusted Hashira before the morning was over. Rengoku Kyojuro arrived first, because Rengoku arrived first for everything, and because the message had used the word urgent and Rengoku treated urgent messages the way most people treat fire alarms. He read the report standing up, which was how he read most things, and his expression went through several phases in quick succession: initial skepticism, careful rereading, a long pause, and then something that looked almost like hunger, the particular brightness that came into his eyes when something genuinely new appeared in his world. A man who kills demons with his bare hands, he said, not as a question but as a statement that he was testing for weight. No blade, no breathing form, no wisteria preparation. He looked up from the report. I want to meet him. This was not surprising. What was slightly more surprising was that Shinobu Kacho, who arrived 12 minutes later and read the same report with her characteristic measured stillness, said almost exactly the same thing, though in her case the interest was clinical rather than enthusiastic. She wanted to understand the physiology. She wanted to know what kind of human body could produce force sufficient to destroy demon regeneration without the channeled power of breathing techniques behind it, because that was the part that didn't make sense even on its own terms. Demons didn't just die from physical damage. They regenerated. The reason Nichiren blades worked was specific and ancient. A bare fist, regardless of how strong the human behind it, should not have been able to produce an outcome that prevented regeneration entirely. Tanjiro had arrived at the Corps estate with Saitama 2 days after the Kane Mori incident, having spent most of the journey trying to explain what the Demon Slayer Corps was, what demons were, and why the sun was dangerous to them, while Saitama walked beside him asking occasional practical questions and seeming generally unbothered by all of it. He had asked whether demons were common. Tanjiro had said yes, unfortunately. He had asked whether they were usually that big. Tanjiro had said that one had been larger than average. He had nodded at this information and filed it away with the same energy he would file away the information that a particular train line ran express on weekdays. When they reached the estate and Tanjiro explained that the master of the Corps would likely want to speak with him, Saitama had said that was fine as long as it didn't take too long, because he wanted to find out what this world's equivalent of a supermarket looked like. The meeting with Kaguya was quiet and strange in the particular way that meetings become strange when one participant is operating on a completely different frequency than everyone else in the room. Kaguya asked careful questions. Saitama answered them honestly and briefly. Yes, he had killed the demon. No, he hadn't used a special technique. He had just punched it. No, he didn't know what breathing forms were. He had trained on his own, years ago, doing squats and push-ups and running every day, and at some point the training had worked very well. He said this last part without any particular pride, the way someone explains that they fixed a leaky faucet by tightening a bolt. Kaguya listened to all of this with his characteristic composure, and when Saitama was finished, there was a pause in the room that lasted just long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone except Saitama, who used it to look out the window and wonder if those were persimmon trees. It was Rengoku who broke the silence, because Rengoku was constitutionally incapable of leaving a silence unfilled when there was something worth saying. He stood up from where he had been sitting against the wall, crossed the room in 4 large strides, and stopped directly in front of Saitama with his hands on his hips and his eyes doing that particular blazing thing they did when he had decided something was important. "I want to spar with you," he said, "tomorrow morning, to understand what you are." Saitama looked at him with the mild, assessing expression of someone trying to decide if a task is worth getting up for. Rengoku was, objectively, one of the most physically imposing people in the room, tall, broad, radiating the particular density of someone who had spent every day of their life pushing their body past its limits. Saitama looked at him the way a professional chess player looks at someone who has just challenged them to checkers. "Sure," Saitama said. "Is breakfast before or after?" Nobody laughed, because nobody in the room was in a laughing mood, but Tanjiro, sitting in the corner trying to be invisible, felt something shift in the atmosphere that he couldn't name yet. It wasn't danger exactly, and it wasn't comedy exactly. It was the specific feeling you get when you realize that 2 things which have never been in the same space before are about to occupy that space simultaneously, and you have no framework for predicting what happens next. He had traveled with Saitama for 2 days. He had watched him eat 3 meals, comment mildly on the weather, and ask a series of earnest questions about demon biology with the tone of someone reading a mildly interesting encyclopedia. And he had also watched him end a Class A demon encounter in a time frame so compressed it barely registered as an event. Those 2 versions of the same person did not fit together in any model Tanjiro had, and tomorrow morning, when Rengoku found out exactly the same thing, the Demon Slayer Corps was going to have to start asking questions it had never built the vocabulary to ask. The training ground behind the Corps estate was a wide, open rectangle of packed earth that had absorbed 20 years of Hashira-level combat, and showed it in every inch of its surface: deep gouges from sword strikes, scorch patterns from flame-breathing exercises, sections of ground that had been compressed so thoroughly by repeated impact that they had developed the density of stone. The estate staff had cleared it before dawn, and by the time the sun was fully up, word had spread through every corner of the compound that something unusual was happening. Slayers who should have been at breakfast found reasons to be near the eastern wall. Tanjiro stood at the far edge of the ground with Nezuko's box strapped to his back, because he hadn't wanted to leave her alone in the unfamiliar estate, and because some part of him felt that whatever was about to happen was the kind of thing you needed to witness in person rather than hear about secondhand. Shinobu stood nearby with a small notebook and a look of focused scientific interest. Several junior slayers had climbed onto the wall itself, despite 3 separate instructions not to, because human beings are fundamentally incapable of not watching when something genuinely unprecedented is about to occur. Rengoku arrived in the way Rengoku always arrived, with absolute presence, his flame-patterned Hayori catching the morning light, his posture carrying the particular uprightness of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he belonged in the space he was occupying. He had been awake since before dawn, which was normal for him, and he had spent the early hours in his usual warm-up forms, moving through flame-breathing sequences with the fluid, total commitment that had defined his entire existence. He was not nervous. Rengoku did not do nervous. But he was alert in a particular way, his attention sharpened to a fine point, because he had read Koichi's report 4 more times since the meeting, and each time the same impossible detail had refused to resolve into something that made sense. He had fought things that could destroy lesser slayers without effort. He had faced demons that warped the physical rules of combat. But a human who killed demons by punching them, who killed them completely, with no regeneration response, with no Nichiren blade and no breathing form, that was a different kind of impossible, and Rengoku intended to understand it with his body since his mind was currently failing to get the job done. Saitama arrived 2 minutes late, which appeared to be because he had stopped to look at something interesting near the estate garden on his way over. He was wearing the same yellow suit, which at this point Tanjiro had concluded was either the only thing he owned or the only thing he considered worth wearing, and he was rubbing the back of his neck with one hand in a way that suggested his attention was only partially on what was about to happen. He looked at the training ground, then at Rengoku, then at the assembled audience on the wall with a slight expression of mild surprise, as though he had expected something more low-key. Rengoku looked at him with that blazing, evaluating focus and gave him a short, respectful bow, because Rengoku believed in courtesy before combat regardless of circumstances, and Saitama bowed back with the automatic politeness of someone who had been raised to match social gestures even when his mind was elsewhere. "I want to understand your strength," Rengoku said directly, because he was not a man who spent time on preamble. "I will come at you with genuine intent. I ask that you respond honestly." Saitama nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "just try not to get hurt." This sentence landed differently on different people. Shinobu raised an eyebrow. The junior slayers on the wall exchanged glances. Tanjiro felt a complicated internal sensation that was somewhere between second-hand embarrassment and genuine apprehension. Rengoku, for his part, did not visibly react, though something in his eyes shifted, not offense, but a recalibration of attention, the kind that happens when a detail doesn't fit and your instincts flag it before your reasoning catches up. He moved without further ceremony, because Rengoku's philosophy was that action was the most honest language available, and everything else was preparation for it. He crossed the distance between them in a movement that the junior slayers on the wall genuinely struggled to track, his body accelerating through the opening sequence of flame breathing. First form, unknowing fire, a straight charge carrying the full force of his physical development, and the amplifying power of a breathing technique that had been refined across generations of the Rengoku family. The impact, when it came, produced a sound that was felt as much as heard, a deep concussive compression of air that sent the nearest slayers stumbling backward and cracked 3 of the wall's upper stones. Dust erupted from the training ground in a wide ring. For a single suspended moment, nobody could see anything clearly. When the dust settled, Saitama was standing in the same spot he had been standing before, his feet having shifted perhaps 2 inches backward in the dirt. His suit had a new crease in the left shoulder. His expression had changed slightly, not to pain, not to effort, but to something that might generously be described as mild interest, the look of someone who has been lightly tapped on the shoulder and turned around to see who did it. Rengoku had landed 6 feet away from him, having rebounded off the impact, and he was staring at Saitama with an expression that was doing something genuinely new on his face, not defeat, because the exchange had been too brief and too lopsided to be processed as a defeat yet, but a rapid, urgent, almost frantic recalibration, like a mathematician who has just discovered that one of their foundational axioms was incorrect and is trying to reconstruct everything on top of that absence. He came again, faster this time, cycling through forms in rapid sequence, a third form, fourth form, movements that Tanjiro had seen dismantle things that shouldn't have been dismantlable. Each one connected. Each one produced that same deep concussive sound. Each one moved Saitama's feet by diminishing increments, as though the training ground itself was quietly communicating to Rengoku that the physics of the situation were not going to improve for him. After the 7th exchange, Rengoku stopped, breathing harder than Tanjiro had ever seen him breathe outside of a genuine life-or-death demon encounter, and looked at Saitama with an expression that had finally resolved from recalibration into something clear and serious and stripped of everything except honest assessment. Saitama was looking back at him with the expression of someone who has been asked to participate in an activity they find mildly engaging but not particularly challenging. He hadn't thrown a single strike. He had simply stood there and absorbed everything Rengoku had, and the only evidence of it was those 2 inches of displaced dirt beneath his feet. "You're holding back," Rengoku said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the only conclusion available to him. Saitama tilted his head slightly and considered this. "Yeah," he said, with complete honesty and no sense of drama around it. "I didn't want to break the floor." The silence that followed this statement was the longest silence the training ground had ever held. Shinobu had stopped writing in her notebook. The junior slayers on the wall were absolutely motionless. Tanjiro was staring at the 2 inches of displaced dirt and doing the mathematics of what that meant, and the mathematics were not resolving into anything comfortable. Rengoku lowered his sword slowly, looked at Saitama for a long moment with something in his expression that had no name in any language the Corps used, and then said, very quietly, "What are you?" Saitama scratched the back of his head. "Just a guy who does hero work as a hobby," he said. "Is there somewhere I can get breakfast now?" The emergency Hashira meeting was called for the following evening, which was the fastest Kaguya had ever convened one outside of an active Muzan-related crisis. That fact alone communicated something to the Hashira who received the summons, because they were all people who had learned to read the temperature of a situation from its administrative signals as much as its content. An emergency meeting with less than 48 hours notice meant that whatever had happened wasn't theoretical and wasn't going to wait. They arrived through the afternoon and into the evening, some from nearby, some from considerable distances, each carrying the particular self-contained energy of people who existed at the absolute outer edge of human capability and had learned to wear that fact quietly. Yuzui Tenjin arrived first after Rengoku, because Yuzui treated all gatherings as opportunities to be visibly present and unignorable. Muikiro Takito arrived alone and sat in a corner and looked at the wall. Mitsuri Kenroji arrived with visible curiosity already activated, having heard fragments of the story from 3 different sources during her journey. Gyomai Heimjima arrived last, as he often did, moving through the estate with that particular quality of absolute stillness that very large, very powerful people sometimes develop as a counterbalance to their own physical presence. Rengoku gave the account himself, standing at the front of the room with his characteristic straightness, and he gave it without editorializing, because he had decided on the walk back from the training ground that the facts of what had happened were sufficiently extraordinary without any framing assistance. He described the 7 exchanges. He described the 2 inches of displaced dirt. He described Saitama's expression throughout, which he characterized as, and here he paused, searching for precision, the expression of a man waiting for something to become interesting. He described the conversation afterward. When he finished, the room was quiet in a way that had texture to it, the kind of quiet that happens when a group of very capable people are all simultaneously reaching the edge of their frameworks and finding nothing on the other side. Yuzui spoke first, because Yuzui also spoke first for most things. Flamboyantly impossible, he said, which was his way of indicating genuine disbelief while maintaining personal style. A human who absorbs flame-breathing impacts without breathing techniques of his own. The force multiplication alone doesn't, he stopped, recalculated, started again. The human body cannot passively absorb that force. The structural damage to muscle and bone would be, he stopped again. What is he? Shinobu, who had spent the previous night reviewing every piece of physiological knowledge she possessed and finding it uniformly unhelpful, said what she had concluded after the reviewing. He is human. His scent is human. Tanjiro confirmed it twice. His behavior is human, in the sense that he sleeps and eats and responds to social interaction in recognizable ways. But the physical parameters are not consistent with any human physiology I have reference for. Gyomai, who had been listening with his eyes closed, spoke from his corner in that low, measured voice that always seemed to carry more weight than its volume suggested. "I would like to meet him," he said simply. This was the meeting's first concrete output, and it produced an immediate secondary question, which was what exactly the Corps was going to do with a person who existed completely outside its classification system. The Corps had ranks. The ranks reflected demonstrated mastery of breathing techniques, demon kill counts, mission survival rates. Saitama had none of those things in any recorded form. He was not a slayer. He was not a demon. He was not an ordinary civilian, because ordinary civilians did not absorb Hashira-level strikes and ask about breakfast. He was something the Corps had no box for, and the absence of a box was genuinely destabilizing for an organization that had spent 2 centuries building its identity around the certainty that it understood the complete topology of its world. Here are the humans, here are the demons, here is the line between them, and here is how we hold that line. Saitama had walked in from outside the map entirely. Kaguya, who had been listening from his position at the head of the room with that quality of deep attention he brought to everything, spoke for the first time since opening the meeting. His voice was quiet and carried the particular gentleness of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world was larger than any single understanding of it. "We should not try to classify him," he said. "We should try to understand what he wants and where he came from, and whether those 2 things have any bearing on what we are fighting." He paused. "He has not harmed a single person since his arrival. He has killed at least 1 demon that would have required Hashira-level response and cost us significant resources. Until we have reason to view him otherwise, we treat him as an unexpected ally whose nature we do not yet understand." This was, by the standards of Kaguya's usual pronouncements, remarkably direct, and it settled something in the room's atmosphere, not completely but enough to allow the meeting to move forward. The question of what Saitama actually wanted was addressed the following morning, when Tanjiro, who had been quietly designated as the person most likely to get useful information out of him through sheer conversational persistence, sat down with him over breakfast and asked directly. Saitama thought about it while eating rice with the focused attention he generally reserved for food-related decisions. "I want to find a way back to my world," he said. "And until I find one, I don't want to just sit around doing nothing." He ate another mouthful. "If there are demons killing people, I can deal with them. That's basically what I do anyway." Tanjiro processed this. "You do this in your own world, fight monsters," Saitama nodded. "Monsters, villains, alien invasions, stuff like that. It gets boring after a while." He said alien invasions with exactly the same flatness he might use to say grocery shopping, and Tanjiro decided to let that specific detail pass without investigation, because he could feel his own comprehension beginning to develop stress fractures. What neither of them knew, sitting at that breakfast table while the Hashira Council dispersed to their respective territories, was that the conversation had already been noticed by forces considerably less friendly than the Corps. The Demon Network was not a formal intelligence apparatus in any organized sense, but demons communicated in ways that moved faster than human messengers, and the destruction of the Kain Mari demon had been felt as an absence by those sensitive enough to perceive it. A demon of that class did not simply stop existing. It had a presence in the network, a weight, and when that weight vanished in an instant with no degradation pattern, no extended combat signature, just sudden termination, the demons who registered it felt something they were not architecturally designed to feel. Not grief, because demons did not grieve, but something adjacent to unease. The particular discomfort of a predator that has just registered a data point that doesn't fit its model of the food chain. That signal traveled upward through the hierarchy with the speed of shared blood, passing through lower moons and reaching the ears of those who sat considerably higher. And by the time the Hashira Council was filing out of Kaguya's meeting room, someone in the upper architecture of the demon world had already asked a question that would not be easily unanswered. Something in the human territories had ended one of theirs instantly and completely, and it had not used a blade. The lower moons met rarely and without ceremony, because Muzan did not believe in ceremony for things he considered beneath his direct attention, and the lower moons were, in the architecture of his regard, tools rather than individuals, useful when functional, replaceable when not. The meeting that convened in the basement of an abandoned merchant house 3 nights after the Kane Mori incident was not called by Muzan. It was called by Lower Moon 2, a demon named Karu who had existed for 60 years and had developed, over that time, a careful and highly calibrated instinct for self-preservation. Karu had felt the absence of the Kane Mori demon the moment it happened, not because they had any particular relationship, but because demons of sufficient age developed a kind of peripheral awareness of the network around them, a background hum of shared existence that you only noticed when part of it went suddenly silent. The silence where the Kane Mori demon had been was not the silence of a Nichiren blade kill, which had a particular signature, a gradual dimming, a trailing off. This was an instantaneous termination, total and clean, like a candle being not blown out but simply removed from existence. Lower Moon 4 and Lower Moon 5 had felt it too. They sat in the abandoned basement with the particular stillness of things that have decided movement might draw attention, and they spoke in the careful, measuring way of creatures that have survived long enough to understand that fear, properly managed, is a survival tool rather than a weakness. It wasn't a Hashira, Lower Moon 4 said. She was a demon who had spent 4 decades perfecting a blood demon art that allowed her to restructure her body in combat, and she had survived 2 Hashira encounters by using it. She knew what Hashira kills felt like in the network. They felt like a door closing, definitive but sequential, the product of sustained combat with peaks and resolutions. The Hashira kills have a shape, she said. This had no shape. It was just gone. Lower Moon 5, who was younger and less experienced and therefore more visibly frightened, said what the other 2 were thinking but had not yet committed to saying out loud. Something killed it that we don't have a category for. The information moved upward from there, because in the demon hierarchy information always moved upward eventually, driven by the understanding that withholding relevant data from those above you was considerably more dangerous than delivering bad news. It reached Upper Moon 6 first, which was where information from the lower ranks always arrived first, and Upper Moon 6 received it with the cold, assessing intelligence that had kept them at that rank for decades. They turned it over carefully, examining it from multiple angles, and what troubled them was not the fact of the kill itself, but the absence of signature. Every demon slayer had a signature. Breathing techniques left traces in the way a battle had unfolded, the force vectors, the pattern of damage, the specific interaction between Nichiren steel and demon flesh. Even Hashira kills, which were devastatingly efficient, left enough residual information to reconstruct the encounter in outline. This left nothing. Whatever had ended the Kane Mori demon had done so in a single action so complete and so overwhelming that there was no residual information to read, only the before and the sudden, absolute after. Upper Moon 6 sent their own scouts to the Kane Mori site, because they were thorough, and because thoroughness was a large part of the reason they had survived to their current rank. The scouts returned with something unexpected, not information about the demon, because there was nothing of the demon to examine but a description of the crater. It was perfectly circular, roughly 15 feet in diameter, and it went down approximately 4 feet into the earth, with walls so smooth and compressed they had the texture of fired clay. The scouts, who had seen considerable violence in their combined centuries of existence, could not identify a weapon that would produce that specific geometry. A blade would leave cuts. An explosion would leave jagged edges and debris scatter. A breathing technique would leave the specific energy signature of its form. This looked like something had applied pure, focused, instantaneous downward force to a single point, and done so with such completeness that the physics of the impact had nowhere to go except straight down. One of the scouts, who had the particular quality of thinking that comes from very long survival, said quietly, "It looks like something hit the ground and the demon happened to be in the way." This description, when it reached Upper Moon 6, produced a period of silence that lasted longer than usual. Then Upper Moon 6 did something they did not do frequently, which was compose a direct communication upward rather than waiting for the monthly gathering. The message was brief because Upper Moon 6 understood that Muzan valued precision over elaboration. There is a human in the Eastern Territories killing demons with bare hands. No breathing signature. Instantaneous kills. The Corps does not appear to understand what he is either. They added one more line after a pause, because they felt it was the most relevant piece of information and the most difficult one to phrase without sounding like they were performing a motion they didn't have. Our demons are not regenerating from his strikes. Muzan received this message in the residence he was currently occupying, a large and well-appointed house in a city 2 provinces away, where he had been living as a human businessman for the past 8 months. He read it once with the complete stillness that characterized him when processing information he found genuinely unexpected. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment, which was as close as Muzan came to visible reaction when something surprised him. He was 1,200 years old. He had built an empire on a single absolute fact, that he was the ceiling of what a living thing could become in this world, that everything above him was empty and everything below him existed in relationship to that ceiling. Demons regenerated because he had given them that ability, and it was not a small gift. It was the fundamental advantage that made the war between demons and slayers a war rather than a simple extermination. Take away regeneration, and you took away the architecture of demon survival. The message said his demons were not regenerating, not that they were regenerating slowly or incompletely or with difficulty. Not regenerating. He did not send an immediate response, which was itself a communication of a kind. In the demon hierarchy, Muzan's silence on a piece of information meant he was processing it at a level that did not yet require external action, that he was turning it over in that ancient, patient, enormously dangerous mind of his, and deciding what it meant before deciding what to do about it. What it meant, as best he could determine, was that something had arrived in his world that he had not made and did not control, and that carried a quality he had not encountered in 12 centuries of existence. He thought about the message's final line for a long time. Our demons are not regenerating from his strikes. He thought about what kind of force, applied by what kind of being, would produce that specific outcome. He thought about the crater the scouts had described. And then he thought about something he had not thought about in a very long time, which was the last time he had encountered something he could not immediately classify, and how that encounter had ended, and what he had learned from it. He decided he wanted more information before he acted. He would send someone capable of observation and analysis, not combat, because this was not yet a combat situation. It was an intelligence situation, and he had not survived 12 centuries by confusing those two categories. He also decided, quietly and without drama, that if the information came back confirming what the message implied, he would need to think very carefully about what kind of response was appropriate for something that existed outside the known ceiling of this world. Somewhere in the Eastern Territories, Saitama was finishing his 3rd bowl of rice at the Corps estate and asking Tanjiro if there was any more pickled vegetable, and had no idea that the most dangerous being in the world he had accidentally arrived in had just turned its full, ancient, calculating attention in his direction. Upper Moon 3 had a particular relationship with curiosity that distinguished them from most other demons in the hierarchy, where other upper moons tended toward appetite, for blood, for power, for the particular satisfaction of destroying things that had previously believed themselves safe. Upper Moon 3 had developed, over 2 centuries of existence, something closer to an intellectual orientation toward the world. They collected information the way other demons collected kills, finding in the accumulation of knowledge a pleasure that was cleaner and more sustainable than violence, though they were entirely capable of violence and had demonstrated this comprehensively on multiple occasions. When Muzan summoned them and explained what was needed, Upper Moon 3 listened with complete attention and asked 3 precise clarifying questions, and Muzan, who generally did not tolerate questions from subordinates, answered all three, which was itself a communication about the seriousness of the situation. The assignment was observation. Locate the human. Assess his capabilities from a safe distance. Return with information sufficient to allow Muzan to make a decision. Do not engage. This last instruction was delivered with an emphasis that Upper Moon 3 recognized as genuine rather than procedural, and filed accordingly. They found the core estate within 2 nights, because 2 centuries of existence had produced tracking abilities that were effectively absolute against human targets, and Saitama was not hiding. He was, in fact, sitting outside on the estate grounds in the middle of the night because he had woken up and found the unfamiliar sleeping arrangements uncomfortable, and decided the night air was preferable to lying awake staring at a ceiling. Upper Moon 3 observed him from a considerable distance, using a blood demon art that bent light around their position and made them effectively invisible to normal human senses. They watched him for 2 hours. He sat. He looked at the sky. He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers with mild interest. He appeared to be thinking about nothing in particular, or possibly everything in general, in that diffuse, unfocused way that humans sometimes occupied when they were not engaged with any specific task. He showed no awareness of being observed, which was consistent with the reports. The core itself hadn't posted a guard on him because they weren't sure what that would even mean. What Upper Moon 3 was looking for specifically was the thing that distinguished a genuinely dangerous human from a situationally dangerous one. A situationally dangerous human was one who had gotten lucky, or who had one specific capability that worked in narrow circumstances. A genuinely dangerous human was one whose danger was structural, built into their fundamental nature rather than dependent on conditions. They were looking for tells. Breathing pattern, muscle density distribution, the specific way a fighter's body held itself even at rest. Every Hashira they had ever observed carried their capability in their posture, a kind of coiled readiness that you could read once you knew the language. They looked at Saitama's posture for a long time. It was completely relaxed, not the relaxed of a fighter at rest, which still carried residual tension in the shoulders and the hips, the body's memory of combat always partially active. Just relaxed, the way a person is relaxed when they have absolutely nothing to be concerned about and know it at a cellular level. Upper Moon 3 had observed hundreds of humans over 2 centuries and had a comprehensive internal library of human physical signatures. This one did not match anything in the library. Not the Hashira signature, not the trained fighter signature, not even the signature of a physically exceptional human who simply hadn't been trained. It was the absence of signature, and that absence was more informative than any presence would have been. After 2 hours, they shifted their position to get a different angle, and in doing so displaced a small amount of air, which produced a sound that was genuinely imperceptible to normal human hearing. A whisper of movement so faint it would not have registered to anyone in the estate. Saitama turned his head and looked directly at the spot where Upper Moon 3 was standing, with the casual precision of someone who has heard their name called from across a room. Not alertness, not combat readiness, just attention, clean and direct, like a searchlight turning on. Upper Moon 3 went completely still. The light-bending art was still active. There was no visual signal to detect. The sound had been below normal human threshold. There was no logical mechanism by which the human should have known to look in that direction. And yet he was looking directly at them, with an expression of mild curiosity, the way you look at a corner of the room where you thought you heard something, not frightened, just acknowledging that something was there. "You can come out," Saitama said, to what appeared to most observers to be empty air. "I don't really care either way." Upper Moon 3 made a decision in that moment that they later concluded was the correct one, which was to maintain position and not respond, because engaging verbally would have been engaging, and their instructions were not to engage. But the decision cost something, because remaining motionless while the subject of your observation looked directly at you with calm, Unconcerned awareness required a suppression of instinct that Upper Moon 3 had not needed to exercise in a very long time. Most things that knew a demon of their level was present in the darkness did not respond with "you can come out." They responded with fear, or with combat readiness, or with the specific frozen quality of prey that has registered a predator. This human had responded with the social equivalent of a shrug. Upper Moon 3 stayed hidden for another 20 minutes, during which Saitama looked at the sky some more, turned his stone over a few more times, and eventually went back inside, apparently having decided the night air had delivered everything it was going to deliver. The report Upper Moon 3 brought back to Muzan was the most carefully worded document they had ever composed, because every sentence required them to describe something that their existing vocabulary was not quite adequate for. They described the posture assessment and its results. They described the sound incident and its results. They described the 2 hours of observation and the complete absence of any readable combat signature. And then they wrote the conclusion, which they had spent the entire return journey trying to find a way to soften, and had eventually decided could not be softened without becoming inaccurate. I cannot assess his upper limit because I cannot find his lower limit. Every human I have observed has a floor, a baseline of physical capability below which they do not go. This human does not appear to have a floor. I looked for 2 hours and found nothing I could measure. I recommend we do not send anyone to engage him until we understand what we are dealing with, because I cannot currently tell you what engaging him would cost us. Muzan read this report with the same complete stillness he had brought to the first message. Then he read it again. He set it down and was quiet for a long time, in the way that something ancient and enormously patient is quiet when it is making a fundamental decision about how to proceed. He had sent Upper Moon 3 because they were his best observer, and he trusted their assessments more than almost anyone else in his hierarchy. Upper Moon 3 had come back and told him they could not find the floor. He thought about that for a very long time. And then, for the first time in a century, Muzan Kibutsuji began making contingency plans. Meanwhile, in the eastern wing of the core estate, Tanjiro had woken up early and found Saitama already in the kitchen, eating leftover rice and reading a list of mission reports someone had left on the table, going through them with the focused, unhurried attention of someone reviewing a restaurant menu. "You're up early," Tanjiro said. Saitama turned a page. "Couldn't sleep. Also, there were a lot of these." He gestured at the reports. "There are way more demons in this world than mine." "That's kind of exhausting to think about." Tanjiro sat down across from him. Outside, the night was still and the estate was quiet, and neither of them knew that somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, Upper Moon 3 was already 3 provinces away and moving fast, carrying a report that was about to make the most dangerous being in the world reconsider the fundamental architecture of his 12-century-old certainty. Muzan had not personally involved himself in the elimination of a specific human target in over 300 years. Not because he was incapable of it. He was capable of it the way a river is capable of drowning a single person, in the sense that the capability was so comprehensive it barely qualified as effort, but because direct personal involvement communicated something about the target that he preferred not to communicate. It said that the target mattered, that they represented something requiring his specific attention, rather than the attention of those he had built and deployed precisely, so that he would not need to attend to things personally. His hierarchy existed as an extension of his will, and sending that hierarchy to deal with problems was not delegation, it was simply the correct use of tools. Becoming personally involved said that the tools were insufficient, and Muzan had spent 12 centuries ensuring that the tools were never insufficient, because sufficiency of tools was the practical definition of power. And so when he decided, 3 days after reading Upper Moon 3's report, to move toward the Eastern Territories himself, he did so with the understanding that he was communicating something, and he chose to communicate it anyway because the alternative was waiting, and waiting had begun to feel, for the first time in centuries, like a form of exposure. He traveled as a human, which he had done many times and which he was extraordinarily good at. He had spent decades in human form across different identities, different cities, different social roles, and he understood human behavior with the comprehensive, slightly contemptuous fluency of someone who had studied a subject exhaustively without ever finding it interesting. He wore the body of a young businessman, unremarkable in every respect, and moved through the eastern territories at a pace that allowed observation without suggesting urgency. He wanted to see the thing himself, not from reports, not from the filtered perception of subordinates who, however capable, were still processing what they observed through their own frameworks and limitations. He wanted to see it with his own eyes and make his own assessment, because he trusted his own perception above everything else in the world, and he had learned that trust across 12 centuries of it being correct. He found Saitama on the third day of his journey, entirely by accident, which was itself a mildly irritating data point. He had been expecting to need to locate him through the residual traces of demon network absence, the empty spots in the web where demons had been before encountering him. But instead, he simply turned a corner in a market town 2 provinces from the core estate, and there he was, standing in front of a food stall with the focused, evaluative expression of someone taking a vendor's offerings very seriously. He was looking at skewered vegetables with the kind of concentrated attention most people reserve for important decisions, and the vendor was describing his preparation method, and Saitama was nodding along with what appeared to be genuine interest. Muzan stopped at a distance and observed. His perception, refined across 12 centuries, reached out toward the human the way you extend a hand to test the temperature of water, and what came back was so unexpected that he stopped the gesture entirely and pulled back, the way you pull your hand back from something that is much hotter than expected. Not heat, exactly, more like the complete absence of any quality he had reference for. Every living thing he had ever perceived had a ceiling, a sense of where they ended, the boundary of their existence in the world. This human had no ceiling he could locate. His perception moved outward looking for the limit and found nothing, the way you walk into a room expecting a wall and find instead that the room simply continues. He stood in the market and watched Saitama eat a skewer of vegetables with complete satisfaction, and paid for a second one with the careful attention of someone managing a limited budget. And Muzan thought about ceilings. He had removed his own ceiling 1,200 years ago, through the consumption of the blue spider lily derivative that had rewritten his biology at a fundamental level. He had become, in doing so, something that had no natural limit in this world, no predator, no competitor, no biological ceiling that anything else could push him against. That was the essence of what he was, not simply powerful, but unconstrained, the only unconstrained thing in a world where everything else was constrained by the architecture of what it was. And here was a human, buying a second skewer of vegetables, who felt unconstrained in a way that was different from his own unconstraint but no less absolute, and the difference was this. Muzan had removed his ceiling deliberately, through transformation, through the radical restructuring of what he was. This human appeared to have simply always been this way, or to have become this way through a process so different from Muzan's own that it produced a qualitatively different result. Muzan's power was his. It was in his blood, in the cellular architecture he had built over 12 centuries. This human's power felt like it was built into the structure of reality around him, as though the world itself had simply decided at some point that this person did not have a ceiling, and had adjusted accordingly. This was a distinction that mattered enormously, because Muzan's power, for all its comprehensiveness, could theoretically be met with sufficient force. The entire existence of the Hashira system was premised on that theoretical possibility, however remote. But power that was not located in the body, not in blood or cellular structure or biological transformation, but in some deeper structural fact about the person's relationship to physical reality, that was not something you could address through force multiplication. You couldn't out-strengthen something whose strength wasn't coming from a body. You couldn't out-regenerate something that wasn't attacking your body, but attacking the more fundamental fact of your existence. Muzan stood in the market and watched Saitama finish his second skewer and look around for a place to dispose of it thoughtfully rather than dropping it on the ground, and thought about this with the full weight of 12 centuries of intelligence and survived crises, and arrived at a conclusion that he had not arrived at in a very long time, which was, "I do not know what to do about this." He left the market before Saitama turned in his direction, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent centuries not being noticed by people who were looking for him. He walked 3 blocks, found a quiet alley and stood in it for a long time, processing. He had 2 options as he saw them, and both were problematic. The first was to ignore the anomaly, to treat it as a temporary disruption that would resolve itself. This human would find his way back to wherever he came from, or he would die of something, or he would simply become irrelevant as the vast machinery of the demon world moved around him. The problem with this option was Upper Moon 3's report, specifically the line about not finding a floor, and the problem with that line was that if there was no floor, the disruption was not temporary. Disruptions with no floor did not resolve. They accumulated. The second option was engagement, direct and decisive, and the problem with that option was that he had just reached out with 12 centuries of refined demonic perception toward this human and found no ceiling. And the honest assessment of that data point was that direct engagement might not produce the outcome he required. Muzan had survived 12 centuries partly through absolute power and partly through absolute pragmatism, and pragmatism was now telling him something his pride found genuinely difficult to process. He went back to his residence and sat alone for the rest of the night, and by morning he had made a decision that he communicated to Upper Moon 1 with 3 words: watch everything. Wait. Upper Moon 1, who had been at their rank long enough to understand the weight of those 3 words coming from Muzan, understood immediately that something had changed in the architecture of the world and began watching. Back at the core estate, Saitama returned from the market town with a bag of vegetables and a mildly positive assessment of the local food situation, and told Tanjiro that the town's vendors were pretty good actually, and that he had found a stall doing something interesting with sweet potato. Tanjiro listened to this with the patient, slightly bewildered attention he had developed for Saitama conversations, and then told him that 3 more demon attacks had been reported in the surrounding province, and the Hashira were convening a response plan. Saitama said that was fine and asked if he could help, with the same tone he might use to ask if he could carry someone's groceries. Tanjiro looked at him for a moment, thought about the training ground and the 2 inches of displaced dirt and Rengoku's expression afterward, and said yes, carefully. He thought that could probably be arranged. What neither of them said, because neither of them knew it yet, was that the 3 demon attacks were not random. They were positioned, deliberately and precisely, in a triangle around the core estate, and they had been sent not to kill but to observe, to watch how the bald man in the yellow suit responded to a threat, to gather the data that Muzan had decided he needed before he made any further decisions. The demons were not the attack. The demons were the question, and the answer they were about to receive was going to make every calculation Muzan had made in the past 3 days significantly more complicated. The 3 demons Muzan had positioned around the estate were gone by sunrise, which was faster than anyone had anticipated, including the Hashira who had been dispatched to handle 2 of the 3 reported attacks. What made the timeline strange was not that they were gone. Demon encounters near a core estate could sometimes resolve quickly when experienced slayers were involved, but that the slayers dispatched to the eastern and southern attack sites arrived to find the situations already resolved, the demons already absent in that permanent, irreversible way, and the only evidence of what had happened being the now familiar geometry of a single impact site, and in one case, a small group of surviving civilians who described a bald man in a yellow suit who had arrived, looked at the demon for a moment with mild assessment, hit it once, and then asked them if they knew where the nearest road back to the estate was. The Hashira who collected these accounts filed them with the particular resigned efficiency of people who had stopped being surprised by this specific pattern and had moved directly to documenting it. The Western attack site was the one that produced a different outcome, because the Western attack site was where Muzan had positioned not one of his standard observation demons, but someone considerably more significant, and that decision was about to generate consequences that Muzan had calculated and accepted, and that were going to prove considerably more consequential than his calculations had accounted for. Upper Moon 2 had not wanted this assignment. This was unusual, because Upper Moon 2 was not generally a being who experienced reluctance. They had occupied their rank for long enough that most assignments felt like variations on a familiar theme, and familiarity had long ago replaced whatever more complex emotional responses they had once been capable of. But the briefing from Muzan had contained enough carefully neutral language about assessment and observation, and do not engage unless the situation requires it to communicate, to someone who had worked within Muzan's communication style for long enough, that the situation might require it, and that Muzan was not certain what would happen if it did. Upper Moon 2 had absorbed this subtext and gone anyway, because the alternative was not going, and not going was not an available option in the demon hierarchy regardless of personal preference. They had positioned themselves at the Western attack site with 3 lesser demons as both cover and instrument, and they had waited, and Saitama had arrived 20 minutes later with his hands in his pockets, walking at a pace that suggested moderate interest rather than urgency. The 3 lesser demons went first, because that was what they were there for, and they were gone in a sequence so rapid that Upper Moon 2, who had expected at least some duration of combat to observe, found themselves watching not a fight but a statistical event, 3 data points appearing and disappearing in a span that their perception, which was extraordinarily refined, measured at approximately 4 seconds total. Not 4 seconds per demon, 4 seconds for all 3. The geometry of the aftermath was consistent with the reports. 3 separate impact sites, each perfectly circular, compressed Earth, no debris scatter, no residual biological material. Saitama stood in the middle of the 3 sites, looked around to confirm there was nothing else requiring attention, and then appeared to notice Upper Moon 2 for the first time, which was interesting because Upper Moon 2 had been concealed with the comprehensive invisibility that came with their level of development, the kind of concealment that Hashira took time to detect and lesser slayers sometimes never detected at all. Saitama looked at them with mild interest and said, "There's one more, right? You've been standing there the whole time." Upper Moon 2 stepped out of concealment, because there was no point in maintaining it, and they did so with the particular quality of presence that came with their rank, not aggressive, not theatrical, just the simple, total, suffocating weight of something that had existed for over a century and a half, and had spent that existence becoming progressively more dangerous. Most humans, encountering Upper Moon 2 at close range, experienced a specific physiological response that was not quite fear and not quite awe but something in between, a fundamental recognition from some deep evolutionary layer that they were in the presence of something their biology had not been designed to survive. Saitama looked at them with the expression he used for mildly interesting things, which was a slight increase in attention without any visible change in body language. "Huh," he said. "You're a lot stronger than those 3. Upper Moon 2 registered this assessment and found it accurate and found the matter-of-fact delivery of it more unsettling than they were prepared to admit. "You can sense that," they said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Kind of," Saitama said. "You feel different, heavier, I guess. The others felt like nothing." Upper Moon 2 stood very still and thought about the word. Nothing applied to 3 demons that would have constituted a serious threat to a mid-ranked slayer, and thought about what it implied about how they themselves were being perceived, and made a decision. They attacked because the situation required it, and because standing still while the subject of your observation told you that your subordinates felt like nothing was not a sustainable position. Their blood demon art was a phenomenon of compressive force and directional control that had destroyed everything it had ever been used against, restructuring the physical environment at a level that went beyond what most weapons could achieve. The opening move alone produced an impact that reshaped the tree line at the edge of the site, a wave of compressive force that traveled outward from Upper Moon 2's position and hit the world with a sound like a mountain deciding to change its mind about its location. The Slayers at the other two sites, a full kilometer away, felt the pressure wave through the ground and exchanged sharp looks and began moving toward the western site at speed. Tanjiro, back at the estate, felt it through the soles of his feet as a sustained vibration, and felt his chest tighten with a recognition he couldn't quite articulate. Not the presence of a demon exactly, but the presence of something happening at a scale that exceeded normal categories. Saitama took the initial wave at full force, standing in it the way a rock stands in a river, and the dust cleared around him to reveal that he had moved his feet approximately the same 2 inches as he had moved them in the training ground exercise with Rengoku, and had the same expression of mild interest shading towards something that was almost not quite, but almost engagement. He rolled his shoulders once. Upper Moon 2 watched the dust clear, and felt something they had not felt since the early decades of their existence, before they had become what they were, before the accumulated century and a half of power had made everything feel manageable. They felt the specific sensation of looking at something and not knowing what it was going to do, the open-ended uncertainty of genuine unknown, and somewhere underneath that, quieter and more honest and considerably more frightening, the first whisper of a question they had not needed to ask in over 100 years. Am I going to survive this? They attacked again, harder, with everything calibrated upward to the maximum they had access to, and the impact this time was of a different order entirely. The kind of force that altered local geography, that the Corps would find evidence of for years afterward in the changed contours of the hillside. When it was over, Saitama was standing 6 inches back from where he had been, and was looking at his own hand with an expression of faint, genuine curiosity, the way you look at something that has unexpectedly caught your attention. "Okay," he said, to no one in particular and to Upper Moon 2 specifically, and there was something in the way he said it that communicated a shift, not in urgency, because Saitama did not do urgency, but in attention, the particular quality of attention of someone who has just found something that is worth the next 5 minutes of their life. He looked at Upper Moon 2 with the first genuine directness he had shown since arriving in this world, and Upper Moon 2, who had spent a century and a half learning to read danger in its many forms, read what was in that look with perfect clarity, and felt the answer to their question arrive with a certainty that left no room for negotiation. They moved, because the instinct to move was the only instinct they had left, and Saitama's fist traveled a distance of approximately 14 inches and made contact, and Upper Moon 2, who had survived 160 years and had never encountered a ceiling, encountered one. The hillside was different after that. The Corps would spend 3 days trying to understand the impact geometry. And somewhere 2 provinces away, Muzan felt the absence in the network, the sudden termination where Upper Moon 2 had been, and sat very still for a long time. Then he stood up and did something he had not done in 1,200 years. He began to run. The absence of Upper Moon 2 hit the demon network like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward in every direction simultaneously. It was not simply the loss of a powerful demon, though that alone would have been significant enough to restructure Muzan's tactical considerations considerably. It was the quality of the absence, the same instantaneous, total termination that had characterized every kill since Saitama's arrival, but scaled up to a register that the remaining Upper Moons could not ignore or rationalize or file away as an anomaly at the edges of their awareness. Upper Moon 2 had been one of the oldest and most capable demons in existence, a being who had survived encounters that had ended every other demon who had attempted the same encounters, and they were simply gone, not defeated in the way that implied a sustained struggle, not diminished gradually by a Hashira whose own limits had been pushed to their absolute edge, but terminated, the way a sentence is terminated by a period, complete and immediate and final. Upper Moon 1 felt it first, because Upper Moon 1 felt everything first, and what they felt alongside the absence was something that had no name in any language demons used, because demons had not needed a word for it in the entire history of their existence. The closest human equivalent would be dread, but dread implied a future threat, something coming, and what Upper Moon 1 was feeling was more fundamental than that. It was the sensation of a structural assumption being removed from underneath you while you were standing on it. Muzan had been moving since the moment he felt the absence, traveling with the speed that came with his nature, covering distances that would have taken humans days in a matter of hours, not toward the site of the confrontation, but away from it, which was a decision that communicated more about the situation than anything else he could have done. Muzan did not retreat. In 1200 years, he had not retreated from anything, because retreating required the acknowledgement that something represented a threat you could not meet, and there had been nothing in 12 centuries that qualified. He was not retreating now, he told himself with the careful precision of a mind that had learned to monitor its own rationalizations across centuries of practice. He was repositioning. He was gathering information. He was making the correct strategic decision for an unprecedented situation. These things were all true, and they were also, underneath their truth, a form of retreat, and some part of him that had survived 12 centuries by being honest with itself when it mattered knew that and filed it without comment. He needed to think. He needed space and time and the particular quality of stillness that came from being away from the thing you were thinking about, because proximity to it made thinking difficult in a way he had not experienced since the earliest centuries of his existence, when the world had still contained surprises. The Demon Slayer Corps received the report of the Upper Moon 2 encounter through 3 separate channels simultaneously. The 2 Hashira who had arrived at the western site to find the aftermath, Tanjiro, who had been close enough to feel the pressure waves and had arrived shortly after, and a civilian survivor who had witnessed the opening of the encounter from a hillside, and whose account was the most emotionally complete if the least technically precise of the 3. Kaguya assembled the Hashira the following morning and read them all 3 accounts, and the room that assembled for that meeting was different from the room that had assembled for the first Hashira Council about Saitama, different in the specific way that a room is different when the people in it have had time to adjust their frameworks and are now operating with a revised understanding of the situation. The first council had been about an unknown quantity, something unexplained that needed to be categorized. This council was about something that had revealed enough of itself to make categorization possible, and the category was enormous and did not fit inside anything the Corps had previously built. Rengoku spoke first, because the information sat within his domain of expertise, and because he had been the first Hashira to encounter Saitama directly and had the most personal context for what the reports were describing. Upper Moon 2 is gone, he said, and the room absorbed this in silence. Not defeated, not weakened, gone in the same way and the same time frame as everything else he has encountered since arriving. He looked around the room with that characteristic blazing directness. We need to decide what our relationship to this man is, and we need to decide it clearly and soon, because the demon hierarchy is going to respond to this, and when it does, the nature of our response will matter. Shinobu, who had been sitting with her hands folded and her expression doing that particular thing it did when she was processing at speed, said what everyone in the room was circling around without quite landing on. He is not on our side. He is also not on their side. He is simply present, and his presence is restructuring the war whether we have a relationship with him or not. This was accurate, and everyone knew it and no one found it especially comforting. Gyomai, who had been still and quiet in his corner, spoke with the measured weight that always made his contributions feel like they had been carried a long distance before being set down. "I trained with him yesterday morning," he said, and the room's attention shifted toward him with a sharpness that acknowledged the significance of this information, because Gyomai was not a person who mentioned things casually. He had gone to Saitama after the first council and asked, with simple directness, if he would be willing to work through some exercises. Saitama had agreed with his characteristic mild willingness. They had spent 2 hours together on the Eastern training ground, and Gyomai had come away with something that none of the others had yet acquired, which was a sense of Saitama as a person rather than a phenomenon. "He is not complicated," Gyomai said, and this sentence, delivered in that voice, landed in the room with more weight than its simplicity suggested. "He does not want power here. He does not want recognition. He is bored, and he is lonely in the specific way of someone who has been powerful for so long that nothing challenges him, and he finds the demons of this world slightly more interesting than the monsters of his own world because there are more of them and they are more varied." He paused. "He will help us because helping is what he does and because he has nothing else to do, but he will not fight for us. He will fight alongside us because we happen to be in the same place as the things that need fighting." The distinction mattered, and the room understood why it mattered and sat with it. Meanwhile, Saitama was sitting with Tanjiro on the eastern steps of the estate, in the early afternoon light, while Tanjiro tried once more to explain the sun-breathing origin and the relationship between the breath of the sun and its derivative forms, which was a topic Tanjiro had been meaning to cover for days, and which kept getting displaced by events. Saitama listened with reasonable attention, asking occasional questions that were genuinely curious, but revealed the depth of his unfamiliarity with the entire conceptual framework. He did not understand why the breathing mattered. He could not feel the difference Tanjiro was describing, and the idea that specific breathing patterns could amplify physical force in the way Tanjiro was describing made him tilt his head slightly and say, "Huh, that's interesting actually," in the tone of someone who finds a thing intellectually interesting without finding it personally relevant. Nezuko, who had been sitting nearby in her box with the lid open, watching Saitama with the quiet, assessing attention she gave to things she hadn't fully categorized, did something at this point that stopped the conversation entirely. She reached out from her box and put her small hand on Saitama's forearm, very gently, the way she sometimes touched Tanjiro when she wanted to communicate something she didn't have words for. Saitama looked down at her hand, and then at her, with an expression that was softer than anything the Hashira would have recognized from their own encounters with him, something genuine and unguarded moving briefly across his face before settling back into its usual mild neutrality. "Hey," he said quietly. Nezuko made a small sound. Tanjiro watched this exchange with his throat tight for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, and thought about what Gyomai had said that morning, lonely in the specific way of someone who has been powerful for so long that nothing challenges him, and understood it differently than he had when he first heard it. What none of them knew, sitting in that afternoon light, was that Muzan had stopped running. He had traveled far enough and thought long enough, and arrived at the decision that his 12-century-old pragmatism had been building toward since the moment he felt Upper Moon 2's absence. He could not defeat this human through force, and he could not ignore this human's presence, and the combination of those two facts left exactly one strategic option available to him, the option he had used at every critical juncture across 12 centuries when the standard architecture of power had proven insufficient. He needed to change the terms. Not the terms of combat, because combat was now off the table as a viable approach. The terms of the situation itself, what was being fought over, who was involved, what winning and losing actually meant. He needed to make Saitama's presence in this world a problem for the Demon Slayer Corps as much as it was a problem for him, and he had 12 centuries of experience turning other people's assets into their liabilities, and he began, in the stillness of his temporary hiding place, to plan with the full weight of everything he was. The plan Muzan constructed over the following 3 days was not elegant in the way his best plans were elegant. His best plans had always carried a quality of inevitability, the sense that the outcome had been determined long before anyone else understood what was happening, that the machinery had been set in motion at a point so early and so quiet that by the time his opponents recognized the shape of it, the shape was already complete. This plan did not have that quality, and the absence of it was itself a piece of information he filed carefully and honestly. He was building under pressure with incomplete data against a variable he could not fully model, and the result reflected those conditions. But it was workable. It addressed the actual problem rather than the problem he wished he had, which was the mark of pragmatic planning. And across 12 centuries, pragmatic planning had served him considerably better than elegant planning when the two came into conflict. The core of it was this: Saitama's presence in this world was destabilizing because Saitama was fighting demons, and the core was benefiting from that without having to pay the costs that normally came with eliminating upper moon level threats. Every upper moon Saitama removed was one the core had not had to spend Hashira lives to address, and Hashira lives were the core most finite and most critical resource. The core was, whether it had fully processed this yet or not, accumulating a strategic windfall simply by having Saitama nearby and pointed at the right things. Muzan needed to reverse that dynamic. He needed to create a situation in which Saitama's presence cost the core something, in which the byproduct of Saitama's involvement was damage to the humans he happened to be standing near rather than protection of them. The most direct way to do this was to attack not demons and not slayers, but the civilian population in patterns that Saitama could not cover simultaneously, forcing a distribution problem. If the attacks were widespread enough and fast enough and the demons aggressive enough, Saitama could not be everywhere, and every place he was not would pay the price for every place he was. The core would begin to experience his presence not as a benefit but as a targeting signal, a marker that drew Muzan's forces toward the humans around him. He communicated this to the remaining upper moons through channels that did not require their physical presence, because assembling the upper moons in one location was now a risk he was not willing to accept when one of them had just been terminated instantly. Upper Moon, one received the plan and understood it, and found it sound within its own logic, which was the logic of someone who had accepted that the direct approach was no longer viable and was working within that constraint. Upper Moon 3, who had observed Saitama at the estate and written the report about the missing floor, received it and found it equally sound, but added a note that Muzan had not asked for and that communicated something about their own state. This works if he does not understand what we are doing. If he understands, he will simply move faster. Muzan had considered this variable and had concluded that it was acceptable, because the plan did not require Saitama to be unable to respond. It required him to be unable to respond everywhere simultaneously, and that constraint held regardless of his individual speed. The mathematics of coverage were not a function of how fast any single entity was. They were a function of how many locations needed covering and how many entities were available to cover them. Muzan had, even after recent losses, considerably more entities than Saitama was one. The attacks began on the 4th night, in 7 locations simultaneously, spread across 3 provinces in a pattern that had clearly been designed rather than occurring naturally. The core response network activated immediately, dispatching slayers to each reported location, but the attacks had been timed and placed with the specific intention of exceeding the core rapid response capacity. Too many locations, too far apart, too close together in time for the available slayers to cover without dangerous gaps. 3 of the 7 locations were handled by core slayers before significant casualties occurred. 2 more were handled late, after damage had been done. The 6th location was where Tanjiro and Saitama happened to be, having been dispatched there earlier in the day for an unrelated report, and it was handled in the now familiar 4-second time frame that had stopped surprising Tanjiro and started filling him with a complicated mixture of relief and philosophical unease. The 7th location received no response in time because it was the furthest from any available asset, and what happened there was what Muzan had intended to happen, not a slaughter, because a slaughter would have generated a response that unified the core and the civilian population in ways that strengthened the core support network, but something more surgical. A targeted destruction of infrastructure. A bridge, a granary, a road junction. Not lives, because lives created martyrs and martyrs created resolve, but the physical architecture of civilian function, the things that kept communities viable, damaged in ways that would take months to rebuild, and that would generate fear and resentment, and the specific political pressure that came from civilian populations who felt unprotected. Kaguya received the full accounting the following morning, and was quiet for a long time afterward, in the way he was quiet when something required him to revise his understanding of the battlefield at a level more fundamental than tactics. The pattern was clear to him immediately, because he had spent his life learning to read Muzan's strategic language, and what the pattern said was that Muzan had made an assessment and drawn a conclusion, and was now operating from that conclusion. The conclusion was that Saitama could not be defeated directly, and therefore needed to be made into a liability. The fact that Muzan had arrived at this conclusion, and acted on it within days of Upper Moon 2's termination, communicated something about the urgency of his recalibration, and that urgency was in its own way more alarming than the attacks themselves, because Muzan operating with urgency was Muzan operating with less than his characteristic patience, and a Muzan with less patience was a Muzan who would accept higher costs to achieve faster results. He called the Hashira together and explained the pattern, and the room absorbed it with the particular grim attentiveness of people who had just had the nature of the war they were fighting change underneath them. Rengoku's response was immediate and characteristic. They needed to extend coverage, disperse more widely, except that the Saitama variable had changed the resource calculus of the entire conflict, and plan accordingly rather than fighting the previous version of the war. Shinobu's response was more measured and ultimately more troubling. Muzan is not trying to win this engagement. He is trying to teach us that having Saitama nearby costs us more than it saves us. If he succeeds in teaching us that, we face a choice between accepting his continued presence and accepting the targeting it brings, or distancing ourselves from him, which removes the advantage. She paused. Either way, Muzan wins the framing of the situation even if he cannot win the direct conflict. The room sat with this. It was correct, and everyone knew it, and no one had an immediate answer for it. Saitama, who had been present for this council at Tanjiro's insistence and Kaguya's quiet agreement, sat through the entire discussion with the focused attention of someone following a conversation in a language they mostly but not entirely understand, and at the end of it he asked one question. How many locations can he hit at once? Shinobu looked at him. At maximum deployment, with all remaining upper moons and significant lower moon support, potentially 15 to 20 simultaneous locations. Saitama nodded slowly, processing this with the practical arithmetic of someone who has spent years calculating response coverage. And how fast can I move between locations? The room was quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed the implication of the question, which was that Saitama was running the same mathematics Muzan was running but from the other direction, and that his variable in those mathematics was his own speed, and that he was asking for data rather than expressing a limitation. Tanjiro, who had been watching him, said carefully, "How fast can you move?" Saitama tilted his head. "Pretty fast," he said. "I've never really measured it." He said this with complete honesty and mild discomfort, because it was the kind of question that reminded him of the gap between what he was and what he had wanted to be, the hollow place where challenge used to be. But underneath that, something else was moving, something that had not moved in a very long time. the faintest edge of something that was not quite urgency and not quite interest, but was closer to both than anything he had felt in years. Because, for the first time since arriving in this world, the problem in front of him was not a single powerful thing to be hit once. It was a distribution problem, a coverage problem, a problem with geometry and timing, and the specific arithmetic of being one thing trying to be in many places. It was, in its own strange way, almost a challenge. And Saitama, who had spent years in a gray, motivationless fog searching for something that felt like a challenge, felt that almost and stood up. Muzan chose the night of the new moon deliberately, because the new moon meant darkness, and darkness meant the demons under his command operated at their fullest capacity, while the human slayers operated at a fraction of theirs. It was a tactical consideration, so fundamental it barely qualified as strategy, using the conditions of the world to multiply your advantage before the first strike landed. He had spent the 3 days since the council deploying his remaining forces with a precision that reflected the full weight of his 12th century strategic intelligence, placing demons not where slayers were concentrated, but where they weren't, in the gaps between coverage zones, in the civilian infrastructure corridors that the Corps had always relied on being low-priority targets, because Muzan had historically preferred to spend his forces on slayers rather than civilians. He was spending them differently now, and the difference was the acknowledgement that the war had changed shape, that the previous logic no longer applied, and that winning now meant something different from what winning had meant 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, winning had meant the eventual attrition of the Demon Slayer Corps and the elimination of the sun-breathing lineage. Now it meant making the world around Saitama so comprehensively costly that the core relationship with him became untenable, and buying time, not for victory, but for the longer calculation that Muzan had begun making in the stillness of his hiding place, the calculation that involved things he had not yet shared with anyone, and that required survival as its prerequisite. The attacks began 2 hours after full dark, and they began everywhere at once. Not 7 locations this time, 19. Spread across 5 provinces in a pattern that had clearly been designed by something with centuries of strategic experience and no logistical constraints on deployment, because Muzan's forces did not require supply lines or communication infrastructure, or any of the physical prerequisites that made human military operations expensive to sustain at scale. They simply existed where he sent them, and he had sent them everywhere. The Core Response Network, which Kaguya had spent the previous 3 days restructuring specifically to address the coverage problem Muzan's first wave had revealed, activated with everything it had, every available Slayer, every Hashira, every resource the organization possessed, deployed into a distribution pattern that had been calculated to minimize gaps. It was, by any objective measure, the most comprehensive deployment the Corps had ever executed. And it was not enough, because 19 simultaneous locations against a Corps that had been fighting a war of attrition for generations was not a problem that organizational restructuring could solve. The mathematics were what they were. Rengoku took the northern cluster, moving between 3 locations with the full speed that flame breathing allowed, his body burning fuel at a rate that he knew was not sustainable for more than a few hours, but that the situation required regardless of sustainability. He handled the first location with the clean efficiency of a Hashira at full capacity, the second with slightly less efficiency and slightly more damage absorbed, and arrived at the third to find it partially resolved, not by a Core Slayer, but by Saitama, who had apparently covered 3 locations on the eastern side, 2 on the southern perimeter, and was now at Rengoku's 3rd location looking at a demon the way you look at something that interrupted you mid-stride. The demon was gone 30 seconds later, and Saitama looked at Rengoku with a brief assessing glance, noted that he was breathing harder than optimal, said, "Go rest for 10 minutes," with the casual authority of someone giving practical advice, and moved again. Rengoku watched him go and felt something that was complicated and honest, and that he would think about for the rest of his life, which was the specific sensation of being genuinely grateful for something you could not fully understand. Tanjiro was at the southeastern cluster with Inosuke and Zenitsu, handling a mid-tier demon concentration that was larger than the initial reports had indicated. And the fight was going badly in the specific way that fights go badly when the numbers are wrong. Not catastrophically, not irreversibly, but with the grinding, accumulating quality of a situation that is consuming resources faster than it is resolving. Zenitsu was flagging, his thunder-breathing depleting faster than his recovery could compensate for. Inosuke was compensating with aggression, which was Inosuke's solution to most problems, but aggression against superior numbers was a strategy with a time limit. Tanjiro was holding the center, rotating his breathing forms with the disciplined efficiency he had spent years developing, keeping track of Nezuko's position on the periphery where she was handling a separate, smaller cluster with the contained ferocity that her demon nature allowed, and thinking through the arithmetic of the situation with the part of his mind that stayed analytical even when the rest of him was operating on pure trained reflex. They were going to be fine, he assessed. Probably. The margin was smaller than he liked, but it existed. And then the largest demon in the cluster, a creature that had been holding back in the rear of the formation in a way that suggested tactical intelligence rather than pure instinct, moved forward and revealed a blood demon art that none of them had encountered or been briefed on, and the margin disappeared. The art was environmental. It restructured the physical space of the battlefield, creating a contained area in which the demon's regeneration was accelerated, and the Slayer's breathing techniques were partially suppressed by an atmospheric change that Tanjiro registered first in his lungs, and then in the suddenly reduced power of his forms. It was sophisticated and clearly had been developed specifically for anti-Slayer application, and it changed the mathematics of the encounter so completely, and so suddenly, that for 3 seconds all three of them simply stopped moving and reassessed, which was 3 seconds they did not have. The lead demon was moving towards Zenitsu, who was the most depleted and therefore the most exposed, with the specific focused momentum of something that has identified its priority target and committed. What happened next happened faster than Tanjiro could fully track, which was not unusual in high-speed combat, but was unusual in its specific quality. There was a pressure change, a displacement of air so sudden and so total that it hit the atmospheric blood demon art like a physical object and disrupted it. The carefully constructed environmental manipulation simply coming apart under a force that had no interest in its architecture. And then Saitama was standing between Zenitsu and the lead demon with the same mild expression and the same hands-in-pockets posture that Tanjiro had seen in the ruins of Kain Mari. And the demon was not there anymore, and the blood demon art was gone, and the remaining demons in the cluster were doing something that Tanjiro had never seen demons do in formation, which was moving away. Not strategically repositioning. Moving away, with the specific quality of motion that was produced not by tactical calculation, but by something more fundamental, the ancient, involuntary response of things that have just registered a presence their biology has no category for. They scattered into the darkness, and the three Slayers stood in the suddenly quiet battlefield and breathed, and Tanjiro looked at Saitama, and Saitama looked back at him with an expression that was doing something slightly different from its usual neutrality, something that Tanjiro, who had spent weeks learning to read the narrow band of Saitama's emotional expression, identified with a start of recognition as something close to relief. Not his own relief, someone else's. The relief of someone who had gotten somewhere in time. "You okay?" Saitama said, looking at Zenitsu, who was sitting on the ground breathing carefully. Zenitsu looked up at him with the expression of someone who has just been pulled out of a river and has not yet processed the being pulled out part. "I think so," he said. Saitama nodded. "Good," he said, and there was something in the word that was not casual, that carried a weight his usual delivery didn't, and then he was moving again before anyone could respond to it. By the time the new moon night ended, 14 of the 19 locations had been fully resolved. 3 had been partially resolved with core SLAYER casualties that the organization would grieve for months, and 2 had not been reached in time. The 2 that had not been reached were civilian infrastructure targets, not people, and Muzan had chosen them for exactly that reason: property damage rather than deaths, damage that would linger and accumulate and generate the slow, grinding civilian pressure he needed. But the night had not gone the way his mathematics had predicted, and the reason was a variable his mathematics had not accounted for accurately. He had calculated Saitama's coverage based on observable speed, the speed at which Saitama had moved between locations in previous encounters, which was fast but not impossibly so. What he had not calculated was that Saitama had been moving slowly, the same way he did everything slowly, not from limitation but from disengagement, the particular flatness of someone for whom effort is not required and therefore does not naturally occur. The almost challenge of the distribution problem had moved something in him, and moved things in Saitama tended to produce results that were not consistent with previous observed performance. Muzan sat with the accounting of the night and identified the discrepancy and understood what it meant, and felt the calculation he had been building, the longer one, the one about survival in time and changing the terms, become suddenly urgent in a way that could not wait for careful construction. He needed to act on it now, before whatever had almost woken up in that bald man in the yellow suit woke up the rest of the way. He sent a message to Upper Moon 1 before dawn. It contained one instruction and no explanation, because the explanation would have required him to say things out loud that he was not yet willing to say, even to himself. Bring me the Kamado boy. Upper Moon 1 moved before dawn, which was the correct tactical choice, and also the only one available, because the window between the end of the new moon night's engagements and the sunrise that would restrict demon movement was narrow and getting narrower. They had been given one instruction and no strategic context, which was unusual. Muzan typically provided enough framing for his upper moons to exercise intelligent judgment within the mission parameters, because intelligent judgment in the field was more reliable than rigid execution when conditions changed. The absence of framing communicated something about Muzan's state that Upper Moon 1 filed without comment. He was moving faster than his usual deliberation allowed, which meant the situation had crossed a threshold he had not publicly acknowledged. Upper Moon 1 understood the mission's purpose without being told, because they had enough strategic intelligence to reconstruct the logic from available information. Tanjiro Kamado was Saitama's point of connection to this world, the first human he had encountered, the one who had integrated him into the core structure, the one whose presence appeared to generate in Saitama the closest thing to investment he had shown since arriving. Remove that connection, or threaten it sufficiently, and you changed the nature of Saitama's relationship to the conflict. You made it personal in a way that was dangerous, yes, but personal also meant specific, and specific meant predictable, and predictable meant controllable in ways that diffuse and general was not. They reached the estate perimeter in the gray pre-dawn hour when the night was technically over, but the light had not yet committed to anything, moving with the complete silence and invisibility that came with their level, passing the outer wards with the patient, methodical intelligence of something that had spent decades studying how the core built its defenses, and where the defenses' assumptions created gaps. The estate was depleted from the night's deployments, Slayers resting, Hashira recovering, the administrative and support staff handling the accounting of damage and casualty and resource expenditure that followed any large-scale engagement. Upper Moon 1 moved through the outer grounds and into the inner corridor with the specific focused momentum of a mission that had been accepted and would be completed regardless of cost, because that was the nature of Upper Moon 1's relationship to their assignments, had been for over a century, would be until something ended it. What ended it was Saitama, sitting on the inner corridor steps eating an onigiri at 5 in the morning, because he had finished his coverage of the night's locations and come back to the estate and found the kitchen and made himself something to eat, which was what he did after exertion in the same way he did after everything else, with the simple practical orientation of someone who treats the maintenance of their body as an administrative task rather than a reward. He looked up at Upper Moon One's approach with the same mild attention he had given to Upper Moon 2, to Rengoku on the training ground, to every threat this world had produced, and Upper Moon One stopped. Not from strategy, not from a calculated reassessment. They stopped because the thing they had been told to do required passing this person, and passing this person was not something their bodies' deep, survival-oriented instincts were currently willing to approve. They had felt the absence of Upper Moon 2 in the network. They had felt the absence of every demon Saitama had ended since his arrival, each one an instantaneous termination with no degradation pattern. They were standing 8 feet from the source of those absences, and their instincts, refined across a century and a half of survival, were saying with complete clarity, "This is the ceiling. This is where everything stops." "You're here for Tanjiro," Saitama said. It was not a question. He finished the onigiri, set the wrapper down beside him with the tidiness of someone who believes in not littering even in operationally significant moments, and stood up. He looked at Upper Moon One with an expression that was different from every expression he had shown in this world, and the difference was this. It was not mild. It was not neutral. It was not the face of someone waiting for something to become interesting. It was the face of someone for whom something had already become interesting 3 seconds ago, and who had moved through that interest and out the other side into something quieter and more final. Tanjiro was inside the estate, sleeping in the eastern wing after the night's engagement, and Nezuko was with him, and the people who were going to try to reach them were going to have to go through the corridor that Saitama was standing in, and Saitama had understood this in the same moment he had understood what Upper Moon One was here for, and had made a decision about it that required no deliberation and no dramatic internal monologue. He simply stood in the corridor. "You can turn around," he said. "Or you can try." Upper Moon One looked at him for a long moment, and then looked past him toward the interior of the estate where Tanjiro was, and then looked back at him, and the calculation that lived in their century-and-a-half-old intelligence ran its course and produced its output. And the output was that turning around was not going to change the fundamental shape of the situation, and completing the mission was not going to be possible, and both of those things were true simultaneously. And there was nothing in the space between them except Saitama, standing in the corridor at 5 in the morning with onigiri on his breath and an expression that was completely, absolutely serious. Upper Moon One attacked, because they were Upper Moon One and they had been given a mission, and the alternative was a form of failure that their nature did not accommodate. The attack was everything they had, which was considerable, a blood demon art of such comprehensive destructive capacity that it had once reshaped a valley, and had ended every Hashira who had encountered it across 4 encounters over 90 years. It filled the corridor with a force that destroyed the architecture around them, the walls coming apart, the ceiling fragmenting, the physical structure of the estate's inner passage ceasing to exist as a passage, and becoming briefly a debris field of compressed force and material. When it was over, and it was over in 4 seconds, because everything was always over in 4 seconds, Upper Moon One was not there anymore, and the corridor was open to the pre-dawn sky through a gap in the roof, and Saitama was standing in the rubble with his suit slightly more damaged than it had been and his expression back to its usual mild neutrality, and Tanjiro was standing in the doorway of the eastern wing in his sleeping clothes, having been woken by the sound. Looking at the destroyed corridor, and then at Saitama, and then at the absence where Upper Moon One had been, with an expression that cycled through several phases before settling somewhere that was not quite understanding, but was the closest he had come to it. "Were you waiting there?" Tanjiro asked. Saitama considered this. "I was eating," he said, "but yeah, kind of." He looked at the damage to the corridor with the mild discomfort of someone who has broken something in someone else's house and feels bad about it in a general way. Sorry about the roof. Tanjiro looked at the roof. Then he looked back at Saitama. And then, because he was Tanjiro and this was the kind of thing Tanjiro did regardless of operational context, he said, "Thank you." Saitama looked at him for a moment with the expression that Gyomai had identified, and that Tanjiro now understood. The specific loneliness of someone for whom the gap between their capability and the world's capacity to challenge them had long ago swallowed everything else, and said, "It's fine," in a tone that meant something considerably more than fine, that carried in its two syllables a weight of something that had needed somewhere to go for a very long time. Muzan felt Upper Moon One's absence at sunrise, standing at the window of his current residence, and was still. He had felt the night's accounting accumulate, the demons that had not returned, the locations that had been covered faster than his projections, the mission's failure arriving with the same instantaneous quality as every other failure since the bald man in the yellow suit had walked out of whatever impossible place he had come from and into this world. He stood at the window and felt the hierarchy around him, the vast structure he had built across 12 centuries, and felt it differently than he had ever felt it before, which was as a finite thing. Not infinite, not eternal, not the permanent architecture of a world he had remade in his image. Finite, with edges and beyond the edges nothing he had made. He thought about 1,200 years of survival, of transformation, of the endless patient accumulation of power that had brought him to the absolute ceiling of what this world contained, and felt the ceiling from the other side for the first time, which was from above, from the perspective of something that had entered from outside it, and for whom the ceiling was simply a floor. He thought about the blue spider lily, about the cure, about the things he had wanted across 12 centuries, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt something that his architecture was not designed for and had no name for, something that the demons he had made could not feel and that he himself had not felt since before he was what he was. Then the moment passed, and Muzan did what Muzan had always done, which was act rather than feel. He left the residence in his human form and walked into the morning, and he did not stop walking, and he did not send any more messages, and the demon hierarchy that remained, the lower moons, the lesser demons, the vast network of creatures he had made from his own blood, felt the absence of his direction with a spreading, structural confusion, the way a building's walls feel the absence of load-bearing supports. Without Muzan's will driving them, his demons were not an army. They were individuals, each pursuing their own hunger, without coordination, without purpose beyond the immediate. The network that had prosecuted a centuries-long war against humanity began to dissolve not from defeat, but from the withdrawal of the intelligence that had given it shape. He walked, and the core did not know where he had gone, and Saitama did not know. And in the absence of knowing, the war did not end so much as lose its center. The way a fire loses its center when the source of fuel is removed, burning at the edges for a while, diminishing, becoming manageable, becoming something that could be addressed by the core that had survived it. 3 weeks later, Saitama was sitting in the core estate garden eating lunch when Kaguya found him. The master of the core sat down nearby with the careful movements of a man whose body was failing him and whose spirit was not, and was quiet for a moment in that way he had, and then said, "Do you have any way back to your world?" Saitama thought about it honestly. "I don't know," he said. "Probably eventually. These things usually sort themselves out." Kaguya nodded slowly. "And until then?" Saitama looked at the garden, at the trees that might be persimmons, at the afternoon light on the compound walls, at the estate that had become, without any decision being made about it, something that felt temporarily like a place he was from. "Until then," he said, "I'll be around." Kaguya was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that he had been working toward since the first morning he had read Koichi's report, something he had not known how to say until now. "In 200 years of this war, we have never had an ally we could not classify. You have been uncomfortable for us in ways that are entirely our limitation and not yours." He paused. "Thank you for being here anyway." Saitama ate a piece of rice. He looked at the garden for a while. It was something to do, he said, which was the most honest thing he had said since arriving, and which Kaguya understood, and which carried in its simplicity everything that needed to be said about a man who had broken his own limits so completely that the world could no longer give him what every living thing needs, which is something that pushes back. This world had pushed back a little. Not enough to matter, not nearly enough to fill the gray and motivationless space that the absence of challenge had carved out of him. But a little, and sometimes a little was what got you through to the next day, and the day after that, and the long, quiet stretch of days that followed the end of something enormous, waiting for whatever came next. The Demon Slayer Corps did not return to normal after Muzan's withdrawal. It couldn't, because normal had been built around the existence of a war that no longer had the architecture that had sustained it, and rebuilding around a new reality was not a return but a reconstruction, slow and honest, and without the comfort of familiar frameworks. The Slayers who had fought alongside Saitama during the New Moon Night carried something from it that did not go away when the operational situation changed. A revised understanding of scale, of what was possible, of the gap between the ceiling of human achievement and whatever lay beyond it. Tanjiro, who thought about things longer and more carefully than most people, spent a long time thinking about what it meant that the most powerful being he had ever encountered was also the loneliest, and arrived at something he would spend the rest of his life working with, which was the understanding that power and connection were not the same thing and did not naturally accompany each other, and that the second was worth more than the first, and that the man in the yellow suit, who could end anything in 4 seconds and could not find a single thing that made him feel alive, was the most complete proof of that understanding he would ever encounter. He did not share this conclusion out loud, because it felt like something that belonged to Saitama rather than to him. But he held it, and it changed how he moved through the world, and that was the kind of change that doesn't announce itself and doesn't reverse. Saitama finished his lunch, stacked his dishes with the tidiness of someone raised to be considerate of whoever had to clean up after them, and stood and stretched and looked at the afternoon sky with the expression he had been wearing since the beginning, mild, neutral, quietly waiting for something that probably wasn't coming. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walked back toward the estate, and the world he had walked into, which would never be the same as the world he had found, went on.